So good afternoon, everybody. I am Anto Budiarjo. Welcome to Monday Live. This is something that we do every Monday afternoon to figure out where the future is heading with smarter buildings. In case you're wondering who we are, all of our profiles are listed on mondaylive.org. Just one point to remind everybody: the views expressed here in this hour is personal, not of any company or organization. And let's have a good sort of questions and comments and on the Zoom chat. And also this deck is on mondaylive.org, just in case you are looking for anything that we are presenting. So this being a new month and this being Cybersecurity Awareness Month, we've decided on Monday Live to make Cybersecurity Month the theme of the month. Yay!
Yeah.
So we'll get more into that. Our agenda today, normal chit chat, and then talking about cybersecurity. And our focus today is really talking about the management of cybersecurity, especially at scale. So hoping to have a really interesting conversation there. But before we do that, hand over to Ken. What's going on, Ken?
Thanks, Anto. It's kind of exciting for us. This is the first month we don't have a monthly automated buildings issue, because it started a few weeks ago, and we're on to the new website, which basically gets posted as it happens. And as you can see, our top post is as it happens, because Mark, our contributing editor, shared that with us. And so he sent it to me on Saturday, and I put it online on my phone, and then got there and added a few graphics and stuff, and we're done, ready for Monday. So that's the new automated buildings model. I'm the agile old man, I guess, trying to figure out what all these kids are talking about. But it's coming together. It's like I've got a tiger by the tail here. I'm not sure. It seems to be moving pretty rapidly, but I like what I see. I love the way it's involving more people and letting more opinions, letting everybody interact a lot quicker. Just some heads up, your title becomes your URL, so think hard on your titles. If you can see, there's marks, so you can see that the first part identifies who it belongs to, automated buildings, and it gives the date it was posted, and then the title is October is Cybersecurity Month. So same thing. Andy McMillan, another contributing editor, has just written the forward for the BACnet handbook. That is well worth a look. Download that. There's some neat stuff in there. We're hard at our 10 education sessions for AHR in Atlanta. They're coming together. We've got strong pressure to add more. I think we may evolve to 12. The theme for this year's education session, I think, is appropriately turning chaos into creativity. Ooh, can't say that word. Turning chaos into creativity. There we go. Anyway, that's what's happening in my life. It's happening fast and furious, but it's fun. Back to you.
Thank you, Ken, and congratulations for kicking off AB 2.0. Mm-hmm. John.
Yeah, hi. A few articles here. Again, the theme. Well, one of the themes that I've continued to try to, collect data and share stories on is, are we going back to the office or not? Right. So here's an example of a company that made announcements and then walked back their own announcements. You may want to read that article about what GM has recently done as far as walking back some of the return to office plans and requirements they put out there. The other one, though, has to do with, I guess, I think everyone in this call is now considered part of the prop tech marketplace, right? Technology, whether it's software, hardware, or whatever, for property management, real estate management, et cetera. That prop tech has become, an investment, platform, right? Where companies invest in prop tech, and we've seen lots of investment in companies that are in that the field of prop tech. So I thought this was interesting that, you know, the tracking that the investments in prop tech are going down, right? And, you know, we're seeing a lot of impact in the financial markets, et cetera. So I don't know what's that surprising or not, but there are some things that are, you know, if you will, are continuing on strong, even while the, you know, financial situation changes. You know, you might think EV chargers, EV cars, right? They're still going full steam and growing. So I thought it was interesting that this story about, you know, confidence and investments in prop tech companies is, you know, wavering. So offer those two this week. You know, take a look at them, see whether you concur out there.
Well, it does
John,
mean
I
it-
actually had a call with one of those funds, investors, whatever the case is, or this morning, and he reiterated what you just said, or what this article
Mhm.
says. And he said ultimately they've been doing it now for a while. They have reached their point. They have no more patience. They are impatient, and that if things don't start producing the way they had hoped for the investments that they made, then as far as they're concerned, things are going to change pretty dramatically.
That's interesting. You know, I think that I've seen, you know, in the years I've been in the industry, waves of investment and excitement in, you know, prop tech, you know, which, you know, I'm involved in. And I think one of the things that continue to see is a lot of the investors who come in, especially if they come in out of Silicon Valley or from that, you know, kind of mindset, our industry is so painfully slow. They just can't get their head around how long it's going to take for investments to, you know, to grow and become profitable and have returns, right? We are in a slow changing market, unlike a lot of the other markets that investment companies invest in. So, you know, and that doesn't mean that a lot of these companies don't become successful. It's just, it takes time. And that, you know, what you just picked on, the patience thing, these investors that come in from other markets don't have the patience, you know.
But you know, John, if they've got a wider portfolio, of course, what the challenge will be is that those people who've already got money invested, the startups, won't get their next rounds in and things like this. So you may well start seeing a lot of casualties, you know, and that kind of brings, you know, as in always in human race, maybe opportunities for other, because it could mean that people could pick up companies or products for, you know, a song and adapt them to their needs, because there's clearly some technologies out there that will or have been developed that worthwhile just won't get the second round of funding or third round of funding, and may well run into financial problems, especially if they're rapidly growing and spending a fortune on R&D.
Yeah, maybe, you know, that last PowerPoint slide in those pitch decks, which shows the timeline, maybe the investors thought 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 meant months when it meant years.
Yeah, probably.
So Roger, a lot of the, obviously the stuff we see here is, you know, North America. Obviously, we also see it for Europe and Asia. But are you seeing, you know, the same in Europe itself? I mean, is it as popular or, you know, part of the everyday conversations?
Yeah, no, it's exactly the same. I was reading an article today, exactly the same as John's pointed out here. And there's a lot of, you know, pockets like in Europe, in Berlin, or here in London, and various places where you have a lot of startups that have been financed. And there's a lot of funds, you know, European funds that have been pushing money into some of these companies. And I think people have looked upon it as another market, which they haven't indulged in before, because we've traditionally been, as John says, slow, unattractive. But suddenly people are looking at prop tech and, you know, it's got a new label and thinking, hey, property here's a real opportunity and anything associated with it. So there has been a lot of activity, Mark. But equally, we're seeing the slowdown now as well in terms of investment, and it's dropping off rapidly, very rapidly.
It's so interesting, Roger, when you talk about that. Basically, You name something prop tech. Now you've got a new context to wrap around it. Now there's money coming in.
Yeah.
I see both sides of the cycle as being, dare I say, I'm an optimist. When there's the hype going on, people are excited, and we've had the last few years. That's been good for everybody. And now there's going to be maybe, I won't call it a slowdown, but I'll call it like a re-engineering, a deeper look. And that's going to be great for the companies who do have technology that actually works. And like, is it, so I think it's good for everybody when there's hype. And I think when there's a downturn, maybe it'll clear out some of the wheat from the chaff. And those companies that have brought something valuable to the market, they'll be just as valuable.
Yeah, and there's, the brave guys will buy at the bottom of the market, and they'll actually take the chance, and just assuming it is at the bottom of the market at some stage, because it will reach that point. But there could be opportunities for those that, as you say, they've got good tech or good concepts, and I think that will be adopted as long as it isn't absorbed by all the bigger guys. It needs still to be kept fresh and agile.
Right.
So it's interesting that we want to consider ourselves as part of prop tech, and I don't see anything wrong with that. But we just have to remind ourselves that prop tech is actually quite a big sort of area. There's lots of different parts of prop tech. We focus on the sort of automation and control side of things. There's the construction side of things. There's the facility management side of things. So have to sort of keep that in mind if we sort of think about prop tech as where we are.
That's a really good. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Sometimes sort of housing and other stuff thrown under there, but I think there's like an area which is under half, but they're kind of called CRE tech, commercial real estate tech, which is probably more where we fit.
Yes. Yeah.
But even in that piece, though, Roger, to Anto's point, under the CRE, there's all the tenant lease management software.
Yep.
There's a whole bunch of tenant management, occupancy management that is not building systems centric. But
also
prop tech.
But also in the construction side, there's a lot of contracting management. There are actually quite a few unicorns in that space. Yeah. Sort of PDF managers of the world. But let's move on, shall we?
Mm-hmm.
I just kind of came across this. It's not anything that's really sort of new or dramatic, but I found it interesting that JP Morgan, as a financial institution, would have quite a number of articles talking about commercial real estate. One about cybersecurity, which came up and is talking about the best practices, and I dug into what they are. They're basically those four listed there. Which is kind of interesting. It's kind of almost like a retail view of commercial real estate, and so I thought I'd just put it up here as a sort of a contrast of how some of the big financial companies presenting this space.
Curious, Anto, did you read what they meant by social sharing?
I can't remember. I did read, but okay. I scanned it. But I saw that as being, I think that's sort of one vector of phishing, right? If you're saying too much on social, then you become known as being somebody that has some information that could be valuable. I think is that angle.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I would have guessed as such, but I'll read the article. Looks good.
Okay.
It's interesting, though. Yeah, just on that thought, just that JP Morgan is putting out a lot of this sort of content, right? That they've got to focus on there, not something that you would normally think them involved in.
Yeah, that was to me was kind of the reason why it was interesting. Any other angles, thoughts? Okay, so Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So we thought we would structure this and sort of present it up front, what we're hoping to cover this month. And this is our agenda for the month. You may be shocked that we actually know what we're going to be doing for the next few weeks, because we normally wing it. But we think there's a conversation on managing cybersecurity. We would like to spend next week talking about new perspectives sort of outside of the direct sort of the scope of stuff that we normally talk about. Zero trust is a major issue. We want to dedicate a week on that, and dedicate a week on talking about broader sort of how do you secure things that are dynamic, with things like resiliency and security and privacy and broader things. And then we want to wrap up the month talking about managing backnet systems. There's a lot of work going on there that I think that will make an interesting month. So with that, I'm actually going to stop the share and start the conversation about managing cybersecurity. Who wants to start? Actually, I'm going to pick on Jim, because you sort of volunteered this topic for this week. Do you want to kick off the conversation here, Jim?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I think that cybersecurity, just to start out with, is an extremely broad topic, and many groups, including the Smarter Stack 25 group and others, have been looking at how to frame the conversation more broadly, how to take the NIST rules and other cybersecurity thinking and apply them broadly to the industry. But when I volunteered the topic of managing cybersecurity, I was primarily thinking of the actual task of cybersecurity for building automation. There's been a lot of work going on over the last 15 years, including the development of the BACnet Secure Connect standard. However, that standard doesn't have everything it needs to be interoperable and manageable. So for the past 2.5 years, a group of cybersecurity architects from most of the important building automation companies have been putting together a document, a roadmap for how we can provide that management capability to the industry. And so that's what I had when I had management in mind. But if you really think about what that means, it has to do with the management of certificates. It has to do with authorization and authentication. It has to do with backup and restore. It has to do with providing IT the kinds of information they need from an enterprise perspective. If all of these building automation nodes are IT nodes, we want to provide IT what they're used to seeing in terms of their SIEM and SOAR tools for managing security. So I'll leave it at that. And Anto, maybe you want to respond to that.
I think that's definitely a very specific area of managing cybersecurity. But I think there are also other areas. I mean, we were talking about the JP Morgan Chase,
right.
phishing. Those are all management. In that case, it's not actually managing the cybersecurity devices or systems, it's actually managing the people and the subject of cybersecurity. So I think it is quite broad. And I know Steve has also done quite a bit of work on the NIST sort of structure, the NIST framework.
So
centric.
From a very high level, I think the first most important thing to get any company's head around is who owns this, who's accountable for the cybersecurity risk. So IT departments have been dealing with cybersecurity risks for a long time. And so they've got clear lines. Any organization of size has at least one security officer, if not multiples, who are engaged in this stuff. So from that standpoint, that raises the question, is that where the ownership should continue to be? So OT has its own lots of cybersecurity issues that Jim's referring to. But fundamentally, before you even get into the weeds, what's the accountability and the responsibility structure? What should that look like? And should ultimately the accountability for cybersecurity across the enterprise, across the organization, should it continue to reside with the IT management, if you will, of which facilities participates, but is not the prime driver. I'm framing that as somewhat of a question, but I think in any larger organization, to think that IT wouldn't be involved is you're making the wrong conclusion. I think they will be, because ultimately cyber is such an important issue for most large corporations like a JP Morgan, that inevitably they're going to insist that they maintain a major role in this. It's not to say they won't outsource responsibility and various portions of the work that needs to get done to facilities and then on to other providers. But ultimately, I think you got to really get your head around who owns this thing at the highest level in the corporation.
I want to make a comment to follow up on that, and it looks like one of our commenters, Sabine, may have actually gotten her comment in quicker than I did. But I just want to share something we've witnessed happening. I would agree that more and more it is the IT department who's responsible for this. But one of the things we've witnessed is they're handed this responsibility without adequate understanding of OT technology.
Sure.
And so they approach you with questions, questionnaires, requirements that they're not germane in many cases to what you're doing. And you work through it, but I think it shows in a different way the massive disconnect between IT and OT that is allowing for this hole that you often have in security. Hitting a vendor or system integrator with extensive IT questionnaire documentation, stuff they have to fill out that actually isn't germane to what's being done, isn't helping anybody, right? And you got to fill it out, you got to do the matrix, you got to do the check boxes, whatever. But what if they're not going beyond that to actually gain an understanding of the OT technologies and the implications of it? In other words, a little bit of an exaggeration, can I check all the boxes no and send it back? And the IT department says, oh, we got our response, we're okay.
Yeah.
Because all they were trying to do is we have to get a response on all these questions.
Yeah.
Right.
So
and we've seen that. So
John, Sabine just said over time that it tends to work itself out. And I would agree that the bridge or lack thereof between IT and OT, because in many cases there is no really good bridge that exists, so that the two sides struggle to understand each other and work well together. But if you make that fundamental decision that it needs to flow up to IT, and that both sides will work together to create a bridge and create the necessary communications, because at a policy level, my experience is at a policy level, it's the same stuff. How you implement those policies in the field, in the OT world, needs to reflect the differences in OT versus IT. But a security policy fundamentally can be applied equally on both sides.
So here's my question to the group is this. We've been saying OT and IT now for several years. And we have been saying that IT, for the most part, does not understand the OT side. Again, that's not rocket science. We've been saying it. As an industry, what can we be doing to increase their knowledge base and their awareness? Again, there's programs out there, there's whatever, but I keep hearing this over and over and over again, and it doesn't seem like we're moving the ball.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the answer is. I'm just throwing that up to the group.
So just let me ask you a really simple question here. What part of OT do you think that they are lacking the most as far as their knowledge?
Well, I won't say the most. I'll give an example.
Okay.
What type of data is involved in an OT system, right? I don't know how many times, and I'd agree with Sabine that with good organizations, it gets worked through. It does get worked through. The question is, it doesn't happen all the time, and it takes a lot of time. But I don't know how many times we've seen that it takes 3 or 4 cycles to convince somebody that the air handler controller does not have any personally identifiable
Information in it.
It doesn't have any. Okay, So let's go on another line of questioning. I know you have to get that answered, but sometimes they don't have, enough understanding. That's just one example.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I asked you that is because, like, through the years that I've been in this industry as design consultant and manufacturing and everything, IT has been the least of my issues or problems. I've rarely had an issue that I could not work with IT. And so that's just kind of why I'm asking. It's always been more about validating, anything that we're putting on their network, working with them to understand their requirements, ensuring them that we have their requirements. And it's always been a very collaborative, I don't know, whatever, teamwork. And so I haven't had a lot of the issues that I have seen others have.
Yeah. So Gina, to be very specific, vulnerability scanning can be a definite problem when IT uses its standard tools to scan OT systems. They can cause all kinds of problems that our systems aren't designed to handle. And then further to that, our OT servers, from a patch management standpoint, again, they can cause all kinds of problems just going in and patching an operating system on a Saturday night, thinking they have every right to do it, and the OT application doesn't support the patch because they don't take in the sensitivity of the fact that our applications aren't, it's a different world for us. So if they don't have that awareness, they can cause all kinds of operational problems for sure because of that ignorance on their part.
Yeah, and that's where I was going. It can be worked through, but what does it say that it takes so much effort to work through it? And if most of that cycle time is coming to initial understanding, the OT side isn't benefiting from the hope that the IT side can lead them to a more secure solution, right? They can't lead them if they don't really understand what the impacts are. And we've seen that patch situation, as well, Steve, right? Yep. So it's just this gulf that we all need to work on, and it can be worked through. Sure. But the gulf says something about the challenges and why this subject continues on. Yeah.
So we're talking.
Sorry,
we're talking about management.
Different. Sorry, Anto, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we're talking about management of cybersecurity and management of IT, right? I'm wondering whether OT is not managing the systems well enough for IT then not to have those issues. Is there a problem going that way around? So the expectation that IT understands OT is a little bit, is that right?
No, I don't think so.
Being made responsible, it is.
I think it's like, I'm just going to give a little optimist point of view. 7-8 years ago, OT and IT were literally like this. Guys were bypassing and FUing the IT, the people on the factory floor. Mark asked the question, how do we get them? IT guys are never going to understand your world. It's just not going to happen. And we shouldn't ever even think that. But what they can understand are the basic rules of cybersecurity and bring that. Say what we're seeing. We certainly have been on plenty of meetings where an IT person has never heard the word BACnet IP. That's not a thing, but we don't make fun of them for that, even though we want to. We're seeing clearly in all verticals a nice melding of IT and OT, and I think it's happening at an appropriate pace. I actually do. I think the bigger organizations, believe it or not, have gone even farther. Like the big Fortune 500, they're already there. They've got IT, OT kind of I think it's happening, and we just gotta understand that you're not bad because you don't know what a VAV is, and you're not bad because you don't know how to make a firewall. So I think it's happening. Now that's a little Pollyanna, but I'm seeing it and can give specific examples.
So,
Well,
so
from a
Anto,
technology standpoint in the industry, what we've been trying to do is bring OT to them, is to bring that convergence on from a technology standpoint, and fuse those technologies together and deliver them in such a way as that it just looks like IT to IT. Now, some of these other policy decisions and other components at other levels are going to have to be worked out. But at least at the root building automation level, we've recognized this problem over decades, and we've been trying to bring it to them in a way that's palatable to them.
so Anto, I do think, to your point about management, that within the facilities organization, there needs to be someone who owns the cybersecurity accountability, design, policies and procedures. And some of the larger companies that I'm aware of have either hired somebody in that role, or they've reassigned somebody out of the IT department into the facilities department to handle this. Because they recognize that they recognize that there are significant differences, but from a resourcing standpoint, they're adding that function into the facilities department. Other maybe somewhat smaller organizations, are hiring third parties to come in and be that resource that takes on that work, that responsibility for the facilities department. So they don't necessarily have to staff it with a full-time person. They can outsource that responsibility to a third party. But in some way, I think facilities departments need to own it going forward.
Tracy, I think you were trying to make a point earlier.
We kind of moved on past what I was saying.
Okay.
So go ahead, keep going.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the challenges I think we have from one of the challenges IT has, it's not a stagnant piece of technology. Their biggest challenge is, cyber problems are forever getting more and more complex. They're getting more sophisticated. You have to constantly stay on top of what's happening. No offense to our industry. Once you put a VAV box in there, it runs for 20 years by and large. Not much you really have to do with it per se. And one of our struggles on the OT side, as much as, we say that IT doesn't understand OT, I think to Bill's point, there's oftentimes we don't understand the complexities of the beast that they're dealing with that changes constantly. And that's a real struggle. And so, I've always had a, very soft spot for the poor IT guy who's in charge of cybersecurity. If he gets that wrong one time, he's never in the career again. He's always, well, you were the guy at, Target that got hacked. Well, yes, that's not a trivial job, right? And so, he has to keep on top of all those constantly changing things is not something that in the OT world we're particularly used to. So I think what Steve is saying, by having a cyber guy within the OT who's, at least plugged into the constant change nature of cyber issues, is a key point to be able to translate that into, what does that mean to the OT side, if anything, at any one point, right? And that's the biggest struggle I've always seen.
I think you're right. And I think we're, it's not the industry's strong point is cybersecurity. When you actually think, I can remember talking to a guy at who was responsible for security at Wimbledon, and he said they were getting something like 1,000 odd hits a minute. People just trying to get in, change the scores and stuff like. And so this is something they do for a living. It's kind of a sideline for us. So, I mean, they are more the experts, but it comes back to what Steve says then. Who owns the whole chain of the security from the VAV box or the smart sensor all the way through to, the controllers, through to, maybe the middleware, the platform, and ultimately, the responsibility for all of it, because we are just putting things in somebody else's building. So probably it shouldn't rest with us, but we should be complying to something that someone else is setting the rules to. We should all be aware of and doing what we should do, but someone still has to be responsible from the end-to-end deployment.
But that's the problem I've got though, Roger. That spectrum of knowledge and skills of end-to-end, you know, deployment from IT, from, you know, protecting corporate mobiles all the way down to protecting the VAV box, you know, or whatever. It's just that skill set is getting broader and broader and broader, right? It's not a trivial thing to, you know, to solve anymore.
No, I was reading the other day that they're actually, you know, when I was reading about AI somewhere, they're saying, yeah, the hackers are now deploying AI on cybersecurity to actually look at smarter ways of breaking into systems, and which, you know, just makes it even more scarier.
So, Steve, NIST has this framework that actually, if you actually go through it, actually starts to cover all of the bases, right? All the way from the planning of things all the way to processes and policies. Can you speak to that a little?
Yeah, so for those who aren't familiar with what Anto's referring to, which is the NIST cybersecurity framework, it basically divides the world of cyber into these 5 buckets of identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover. And within the identify bucket is where you need to come up with who, you know, what's your management for the whole process, who owns this thing, and that's where you're going to define what your processes and policies are, and you're going to find out, you're going to know what you've got in your building, and in detail, not just at a hardware level, but at a software level. So all of that is a process that that can be applied to IT or to OT. It's just how you think about it, how you approach this problem at a high level, and then from there, the other areas like detect would be, okay, how do I determine whether I've been breached or not? So what kind of tools do I need to have in place? What kind of alerting system do I need to have that tells me that something bad has happened? And then protect are the kinds of things that you would do to, like putting in something like a Tazi box to prevent unauthorized access from a remote perspective over the internet. So there's a wide variety of technologies, and BACnet SC is another example of protect in terms of protecting the network itself from in a variety of ways. When we'll talk about that later in the month. But then, you know, respond and recover is okay. Something bad happened. Do I have a disaster recovery plan in place to handle it on that bad day when I get notified that all hell's broken loose? Do I know what I'm going to do, or am I going to be caught flat-footed and I'm trying to recover? You know, I'm trying to get past it. Meanwhile, I got tenants who can't get in the building. I've got equipment that's not running. I got the lights that are off. Who knows what could possibly go wrong? But a lot of things do go wrong. But am I prepared in any way, shape, or form to deal with it ahead of time? That's why you put in disaster recovery plans. And then finally, you know, you want to then figure out, well, what happened? Lessons learned. So that's the last bucket. So all this has been readily available for years, and a lot of organizations have adopted the NIST cybersecurity framework, and things like 6.2 ISA. And I know ASHRAE is working on some equivalencies. So, but there's a lot of cross correlation to the way NIST has set this up, and it's all good. But yeah, that's why I say the framework can be applied, and we're using it, as you know, Otto, in the Coalition for Smarter Buildings, as the way we're addressing cyber there.
So there's been a very interesting comment from Matt White, and I want to bring him on to as a panelist here to share his thoughts. His comment is really about going back to the ITOT, making sure that the understanding is both ways. Maybe that's paraphrasing it wrongly, but Matt, all yours.
Yeah, the discussions around these often kind of crack me up from the background basis of, because obviously IT is a very well developed world. InfoSec, cybersecurity, like there are just thousands and thousands of these folks that exist. This industry is huge. And then you have this automation industry that's separate, wherein it always gets qualified under OT technologies. And it always seems like it's being discussed under the perspective of IT joining that space versus the automation industry space joining the IT world, which seems like has done all the work of creating all of these standards, all the devices, all the infrastructure, all the training courses, everything else in place. You're just now bringing in new devices into that space, a new type of system that connects into it. So then who is immigrating into whose world? And so then who should assimilate? And it's interesting because in our space, and I know Sabine can talk to this as well, you have lots of manufacturers and vendors in this space that talk about how they're cyber secure and doing all these great things. And while Bill can back that up with documentation and all that for his products, most can't. And when you take things like different controllers, sensors and whatnot and stick them in a network lab and start testing them, and you find out they have 10-year-old operating systems on them that they've been using forever, they just kind of change the way the controller looks or the way the device looks, or they don't even fully support a full latest and greatest IP stack. And then when you start asking them questions about, do you support, it's crickets, and you don't get answers to your emails because they literally don't have a developer on staff that can answer the question at that level. And so it seems more like we're always trying to advise the IT. I think they have reason to be cautious. I think they have reason not to know. I think things like BACnet SC and whatnot as serial protocols and things, I think those strategies are going to get pushed closer and closer and closer and kept at the edge. And they're going to be isolated to only very specific exceptions. And eventually everything is going to be IP based and be on the network. And if something is serially connected, it's going to be considered old school and dangerous, and it's going to be done in a very secure way. And BACnet SC will be irrelevant at that point, because if you have a properly deployed network, you'll have it so locked down that BACnet or BACnet SC doesn't really matter. It's secured. It ain't going to be able to do anything anyway. So those are just kind of some thoughts around the whole context of the thing and how a lot of the discussions seem to form and mold and go. But in working with customers that have very well put together cyber groups and IT security, they fully understand the whole thing, and they don't really care about what serial network you're using, and they don't care how it works. They know how they're going to isolate it and secure it. So then they'll create the standards for that. And so then it's more I think it's more around this industry of automation. Why aren't all the manufacturers and why aren't the vendors learning and understanding this space that they want to get into, being the IP world? Why aren't they assimilating, since they're the immigrants, so to speak?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges
we've been making some strides there. One of the problems is that although the corporations themselves, the controls vendors, are making great strides in a lot of these areas that you mentioned, it's making its way out to the channel much more slowly. So when you're actually talking to installers that are working for these companies, it's hard to get answers. But I can tell you that as an industry, we have been working on these problems. I would like to point out one other thing as well. BACnet SC is not a serial technology. In fact, it does not secure or apply to MSTCP networks, MSTP networks, period. It's actually only an IP technology. And the MSTP and other serial networks in BACnet are secured by firewall routers in the new architecture. And I look forward to talking about this more later in the month, and I hope you'll join us to see what we've been working on for the last several years.
But just to add to that challenge too, Jim, I think the other one we have, Matt, is that, again, we have systems that are in buildings that date back 10, 15 years, right? So those systems aren't going to be changed out they're not going to be upgraded. You know, you don't upgrade the VAV box controller like you upgrade your laptop, and you know, when you upgrade your laptop, you get all the additional cybersecurity requirements as well. So part of our struggle is also dealing with a lot of legacy stuff, right? And how do we make legacy stuff compliant with these new rules, which are changing rapidly, as we spoke earlier about that sort of stuff. And the compound of that is that's actually, you know, back on my hobby horse a little bit, that's one of the other areas that the IoT guys are being successful in, because the IoT guys are coming in with technology that's only, you know, this year, last year's technology. And it's a lot easier for them to become compliant with IPsec and, you know, other IP security infrastructure, because they're building on the latest stacks and they're building on the latest tool sets and the latest cybersecurity. So it becomes an easy step for them. And then again, if I was a building owner, that's another plus as to why IoT can be successful, because you are quickly more compliant with the IT. And I agree with you 100%, Matt, but it has to belong into the IT world, because the world is changing too fast for anyone else to keep up. But, you know, the poor guy who's got the 30-year-old building with the 15-year-old control system, he's not going to change it out, all that stuff. Now, there are other ways to deal with that, right? I mean, but the controllers themselves are never going to be upgraded.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it depends on the context of what you're talking about, right? So if you're talking about convergence of OT and IT, the guy with the 1980s Andover orange panels hanging on the wall is likely not in that situation where he has a full network group talking about IT/OT convergence. He doesn't have a network group. They've got a vendor that comes and slings Cat6 when needed. That's the extent of his network group. So in that case, then yeah, vendors understanding what is best practice, but even where are they getting their best practice understanding? Are they getting it from the IT world, or are they getting it just from what the automation industry is coming up with? In the context of an intelligent building portfolio or building wherein you have a full InfoSec group, you know, IT group within that company, they're going to have things in place. And just like what your roster showed of things, discussions you're going to have coming up, when you get into things like zero trust and all of that, you know, that's where my question around like BACnet SC certificates and all those kinds of things come into play. Are they relevant at that point? Or is now what is being deployed by the IT group over that converged network, managing those VLANs, managing what's trusted, what isn't, is that now handling it? And so now those devices can just be the devices that they are, you know, keeping themselves updated, their stack, their OS, all that kind of stuff. So I think it very much depends on the context of the conversation of what you're talking about, who these folks are, that then says where those things scale from, or how they scale, or how they get used. But yeah,
Matt, let me jump in on Matt right here. So Matt's comment that he put in and what he's saying and what we're saying, man, it's almost less about the tech right now and more about the communication and the humanity here. And Matt, I mean, I think you're alluding to that a little bit. A lot of this is a human issue inside of the context of whether who's going to fit into whom and who needs to fit into whom. And is that even, it's not a black or white, it's all gray, and it can work like this, whether you want a converged network, you want to segment your networks, it kind of doesn't matter. I'm seeing it as an almost organization by organization issue, depending on the personalities of the people in those issues, in those organizations. That sounds crazy, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it does, because there are now products out there or manufacturers where you can put together a whole architecture for a system, brand new. You can put together a whole architecture system completely IP based, and you're not relying on any older, you're not relying on those protocols anymore, because this is now just like having any other IP device on the network. And they have their own functions. They're basically industrial PCs that have a Linux image on them, and they're running whatever the manufacturer is doing. And that's kind of where we see a lot of this headed, especially with the big global players and companies, because where they're looking at things now where it's like, I need this data, I need to assimilate it, whether I'm operating my building or I'm using it for other purposes. I need it to be managed within my network, kept up to date, not creating risk, and all be usable. So at that point, a controller down in a field now, I just need IO. I don't really care about, you know, what brand is on it or anything else. As long as they got a local vendor who can competitively bid against other guys for service contracts and stuff like that, great, hunky dory, give me the data. Get it on the network and get it to me. I don't want to spend all this time troubleshooting these old serial networks and everything. But then when you switch back over though to the controls guy who's he's a small contractor and he's only working on those buildings where they don't have those types of groups or policies. And it is just the building engineer who's literally still has modems hanging on the inside of door enclosures that don't shut because of all the crap inside of it, right? And that's going over to an old Windows PC that's still running Procom or some other hot mess of some legacy system. That's very different. So now it's on that contractor to provide best practice. But what's interesting is like, where do these guys get all their technical training? Usually those contractors are electricians who are very good electricians. They get like some ComSpec or other certifications for proving that they can do data wiring. And then they get all the rest of their technical training from a manufacturer, right? They're Honeywell approved, they're Distech approved, they're JCI approved, whatever else. And in those, it's not necessarily taught best IP practice. So to me, that's where there's like, those guys create a lot of risk because there is no governance over them and it's left up to them. And they are not a low voltage network contractor. They are an electrical mechanical contractor for all intents and purposes, right? These guys, are deploying these systems. So to me, that's where the biggest knowledge gap is. And the guys who can create the most risk for properties and owners because they just don't have the knowledge or the experience. So then it's kind of like, well, who's it on then to train them, to get them so that is it on the manufacturer who's providing the certifications for these guys and you tell them everything else. If you're Honeywell, you tell them what kind of wire to pull, what the distances they can go to, how to address stuff and everything else. So then why not complete the thought and start bringing some of that IT knowledge and training those guys on it so that we don't screw over the poor building engineer who doesn't have any direction from his own company.
Right.
I think the scary bit is, Matt, are the specifiers and the mechanical contractors who are buying this stuff, are they really aware of what they should be buying or not? And usually, or specifying, and they're usually not. They don't have that skill on board at all. And so that's a generalism, I understand that, but in the industry, certainly here in Europe, you'll actually find that, a lot of the consultants and certainly the mechanical contractors, now have to lean on other people like MSIs and others to try and help them through this because it's not a skill set they have yet. They're the people that are actually placing the orders for the stuff that's going to go in the buildings.
Yeah, so that's the workaround, right? So the smart building consultant or in some cases, the MSI who's bridging that gap is having to facilitate that. Even to some degree, though, the type of client who is going to hire a smart building consultant or an MSI typically has a good presence of IT folks, or they don't have the size of project that justifies those roles, right? Yep. So therein, it's kind of the same thing. Wherein the smart building consultant and the MSI usually is helping ensure that the MEPs, right? Because there's a knowledge gap there too on the MEP side. These guys are designing systems and they got very used to over the years, many of them recycling specifications. And so when they recycle these specs, they're just relying on the local vendors and the manufacturer who gave it to them to, I'm assuming that they wrote what is best practice and that's why I'm sticking it in the construction docs. And so then that,
years ago, it was written as well, and don't forget, 80% or more of the buildings are small buildings as opposed to the big ones, which is where some of the bigger customers can afford to actually ensure they're getting secure systems. But at least more and more, it is the real estate guys that are getting very smart on this that actually know about it. But it's the ones below that really are at risk.
I think we understand that we have a huge training gap in the industry. And Melissa Boutwell, who many of you may know, has been working with the U.S. Department of Labor to create a curriculum specifically around this area and working with channels of building automation companies to begin to deploy that. Obviously, that's going to take time to propagate through, but The problem has certainly been identified, and people are acting to try to train and enhance and bring more people with those skill sets into our industry.
So are you guys,
as-
I was gonna say,
Go ahead.
another quick question. Are we seeing, at least I am, that some of the larger MEPs that really have grasped the idea of a smarter building, like Newcomb and Boyd, and I see Paul Maximux on here, and people like Burns and McDonald and a few others, that when they are designing these buildings, that they are building in the cybersecurity requirements and this, that, and the other. Do we see that as an area that is only a few, or we see this as an area that is really starting to take hold?
On projects that I've been on, it's been a few. But that's why we were on the project, right? It was to help sort of facilitate that crossover communication. But the challenge there is onboarding a smart building consultant or someone soon enough to have influence over that, right? Like, so in a lot of advisements, we're, end up even advising the client on here's how to hire your MEP team. Here's the qualifications for an MEP team that can actually put in systems, design systems, like let's say they can actually write a comprehensive Div 25. So there's a lot of folks recycling Div 23s that then also are claiming they'll write a Div 25, but the Div 25 just looks like the Div 23, and it describes nothing about how all these systems tie together and anything around the data security or anything like that. They just don't know how to create that. Those are far and few between. So helping them make sure they hire the right team. If they haven't hired the right team and you're coming in late, then you're just doing a lot of training. You're doing a lot of education around the impact that their design will have on the ability for those systems to function on the network, and having to bridge that gap between the IT folks, making sure they have the warm and fuzzy. And that could be doing everything from pre-testing the products that come in and or providing a list of recommended products that can or can't be used, or, it just falls on someone to be the holder then of filling the gap of managing then all those devices that are going to go into that building, how they're going to communicate, so that one, IT is willing to actually, hand over addresses and let you put them on the network, let alone share data between them or go out to some cloud or whatnot. So there's still big gaps. There are some bigger firms that are really good at it and do it quite well, and it's impressive. But then there's others that seem like they would have it, but then when the rubber hits the road, there's not much there. They're really just regurgitating specs, old specs.
Okay, thank you, Matt. As we start to wrap up, I'm looking for somebody to do a quick wrap up. That's not spoken much. Tracy, you want to do that? No.
I think there are more qualified people than me on cybersecurity to do a wrap up today.
Well, I was thinking somebody
Jim
not
should finish it.
Okay, Jim, go ahead.
I think a lot of great topics were covered today. And I think that if you join in over the next several sessions, I think we're going to cover a lot more and flush out a lot of the work or thinking that's been some under wraps somewhat within the industry. And hopefully you'll get a chance to see it. But I think that these other elements, like the training element, are critical, and the higher level management decisions are critical. And I think that this, question whether IT is going to own the space is a very interesting one. We've been prognosticating that for years. There's only one thing that hasn't arrived with IT's owning this, and that's any budget to own it with. So I'd like to see how that shakes out in the future. But please join us for the next several sessions. I think there'll be a lot more good discussion on the topic.
Nice.
Okay.
Very good.
Nice.
Thank you.
Well done, Jim.
Thank you, Jim. Yeah. And that wraps it for today. Thank you, Matt, for joining us. Thanks, everybody, for being here. We'll come back next week and continue this conversation. Meanwhile, video will be out tomorrow. Well, bye-bye all.
Adieu.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.